これとこれでこれとこれで
ありがとうございます。ありがとうございます。
で1000万伝票です。
ありがとうございます。
イエーイ。
Imagine yourself as a father in Japan in the year 2012, raising a young daughter who is currently attending high school. As she's now only a few years away from entering university, and afterwards having her own career, you decide to ask her one evening, Ayaka, what kind of career would you like to pursue when you become an adult? Naturally, you expect an answer along fairly conventional lines. Perhaps she might say that she wants to become a teacher, an office worker, or even a doctor. After all, she has been performing quite well academically, and you've been taking quiet pride in her achievements. However, if you are indeed an average Japanese father asking this very question in the year 2012, the most statistically probable response that you could have expected to hear from your daughter was, well, a kyabajo, or a hostess working at a hostess club. This answer, that hostess was the #1 occupation that high school girls aspired to pursue when they became adults, was based on different magazine survey results in 2012, and the result did shock quite a number of people in Japan at the time. But then again, various survey results from the 2000s to the early 2010s back up this sentiment of the time. For example, a 2007 survey conducted by a private cultural studies think tank institute among young women in Japan aged between 15 to 22 showed that more respondents within this age bracket wanted to become a hostess, compared to the more traditionally respected professions in Japan expected to be held by female individuals, such as nursing or working as a civil servant. Hence, the implications were more than clear. It was thought of as rather glorious for a significant number of young women at the time in Japan to be working as a hostess. But fast forward to the present day, and the situation could not be more different. Across Japan, hostess clubs are currently closing their doors one after another in the fastest rate that the industry has ever seen since its post-war inception. According to a 2024 report by Tokyo Shoko Research, the number of hostess club bankruptcies reached a 10-year high in the first half of 2024, representing a staggering 161.1% increase compared to the same period the previous year. And if you were to stop a young woman on the streets of Japan today and ask her whether she'd like to become a hostess, you'd most likely receive an answer in the lines of,
キャバクラで働きませんかって言われたら、あ、やだ。
So what exactly happened? How did Japan's hostess clubs go from being one of the most desired career destinations for high school girls across the nation to becoming an industry that are now being shunned by many and plagued by some of the fastest rising bankruptcy rates in the entire country? In today's video, we are going to explore the rise and the dramatic decline of Japan's hostess club industry. Now, we cannot talk about the fall of Japan's hostess club industry without first discussing its meteoric rise as a core part of Japan's night entertainment culture for several decades. First, the Japanese word for hostess clubs, Kyabakura, is actually a combination of two words, the French word cabaret and the English word club. Many in Japan actually don't know this as well, but before Kyabakuras ever became a thing in Japan, cabaret first emerged across Japan from around the 1930s, where guests sat at tables and watched women perform on stage. On the other hand, establishments simply known as clubs are essentially just higher-end hostess clubs compared to the ordinary kyabakuras that charge higher hourly rates compared to the typical kyabakura and caters to the more wealthier customers. They still exist today, and the female employees working at them are still referred to as hostesses. But once again, going back in time, in 1976, what is widely considered as the first modern kyabakura or hostess club establishment, Club Royal, opened its doors in Asakusa, Tokyo. Now, Club Royal introduced a new concept to Japan's nightlife scene. Instead of customers sitting at tables and watching female performers on stage, female staff would sit beside customers and engage in relaxed conversations with them while sharing drinks together. And this concept became an immediate hit. Combined with Japan's rapid economic growth during the 1970s, many business owners and salarymen began frequenting hostess clubs with their co-workers or business clients for their after-work drinking sessions. and before long, hostess clubs had become deeply embedded within Japan's corporate entertainment culture. In fact, the Japanese word for hostess clubs, Kyabakura, actually went on to win the 1985 Japan New Words and Popular Words Award in the expression category, demonstrating just how much the word hostess club was being mentioned by the everyday citizens of Japan at the time. And things were also working in the industry's favor on the legal front as well. In 1986, Japan's Act on Control and Improvement of Amusement Business was extensively revised for the first time in 20 years, meaning that all forms of hostess clubs across Japan now became fully recognized and regulated businesses that could operate legally with official licenses. This meant business owners and salarymen during Japan's economic bubble era could now enter into hostess clubs with their co-workers, business partners, and important clients without any legal questionability, and bill the costs incurred from their time spent at the hostess clubs completely legally as business expenses. But with all of this said, another question naturally arises. Why did so many of young women across Japan themselves want to become hostesses? I mean, what was so appealing about sitting next to middle-aged salarymen, talking to them, and drinking together late into the night? This could largely be boiled down to a few reasons. First, there was the obvious financial element. With hostess clubs having become fundamentally ingrained in Japan's corporate entertainment culture, many business owners, wealthy real estate developers, company executives, and so on regularly treated their important clients at these establishments during the evening. Now, from a Western perspective, this practice may indeed sound somewhat unusual, but in Japan, especially in the past, building relationships with colleagues and business partners over drinks after work was considered as a vital extension of conducting business. And if things were talked out well during their time at the tables laid out in these hostess clubs, such as a real estate deal over land in the heart of Tokyo successfully being finalized, or so on, the designated hostess, who was also sitting next to the businessmen at the tables, putting on smiles, pouring drinks, and appropriately participating in their conversation at the right time, would often receive extremely large tips, even in the ranges that went beyond 1 million yen or 10,000 US dollars. For many young women in Japan, this was the kind of money that would have been nearly impossible to earn in a conventional job. And it was precisely this combination of financial opportunity and perceived glamour that drew many young women across Japan towards the idea of becoming a hostess, even well into the 2010s. But then, at the end of the day, a hostess was still ultimately considered as an occupation within the night entertainment industry, right? And in most other countries, it would just be very difficult to imagine high school girls publicly and rather proudly proclaiming, "I want to become a hostess when I grow up." And the reason for this rather positive social perception of hostess clubs in Japan, well into the beginning of the 21st century, was mostly thanks to the carefully curated image of hostesses depicted in Japan's popular media. To illustrate this, let's briefly take a look at the manga scene. Starting from around the late 1990s, a number of manga series began appearing in Japan that either subtly or actually quite conspicuously glamorized the lives of hostesses in Japan. In 1997, there was the publication of the manga Omi's no Hanamichi, which can roughly be translated into English as The Flower Path of the Water Trade, with the phrase water trade referring to nightlife industry professions in Japan associated with the serving of alcoholic beverages. The story centers on a female hostess who used to be the former #1 hostess at a club in Roppongi, a well-known nightlife district located in Japan's capital city of Tokyo. This manga featured some cult classic lines that are still being quoted by people in Japan today, including the famous phrase, "The lifespan of a flower is short, and if it doesn't bloom, it will only rot." The original manga series was insanely popular, with it being serialized into 15 volumes from 1997 to 2002, with a sequel also being published in 2012. Throughout our research, we've also found that not only was it an immensely popular manga, but that it was even made into 2 different TV drama series in 1999 and 2001 by none other than the Fuji Television Network. By the way, if there are any one of our subscribers who have read Omi's no Hanamichi, please feel free to inform us on the allure of this manga series in the comments below. And this romanticization of hostesses in Japan's popular manga and drama only continued into the 2000s to the 2010s, with the manga series Jote Super Queen, similar to Omi's no Hanamichi, having both its film adaptation being released in Japanese theaters, as well as its television drama series being aired on TV Asahi Network in 2007. And we could just go on and on with such manga, film, or drama series of the era that help in the successful romanticization of the Hostess Club scene, but we believe you guys get the idea. And it would be impossible to discuss this metamorphosis of hostessing in Japan from what was once considered night industry work into something closer to almost an honorable profession without also discussing the pivotal role of magazines. Japan was, and still very much is to a degree, an analog country. Before the age of smartphones and social media, literally the only sources where people could receive information on the most recent trends in Japan were from newspapers, magazines, television variety shows, and the likes. I personally first came to Japan in 2012 for university, and in hindsight, I'm actually quite glad that I did, because I was able to witness what was probably the final moments of what could truly be called the old, analog Japan. You know, the type of Japan similar to what you see in the movie Lost in Translation. In 2012, the Japanese yen was worth more than twice as much against the US dollar as it is today, meaning that there were nowhere even close to the number of foreign visitors in the country compared to now. This was the time when the Japanese telecommunications company SoftBank was just introducing the iPhone to the Japanese market, and smartphones were still nowhere near widespread. But then, Shinzo Abe became the Prime Minister of Japan from December 26, 2012, began his Abenomics economic policy, and started to depreciate the yen at such an aggressive pace, which officially began the massive influx of foreign tourists to the country that is still going on to this day. Smartphones and social media began to get properly popularized across the nation, and much of the distinctive charm of the old analog Japan unfortunately did begin to fade away, from what I have personally observed as 2013 onwards. But anyways, the reason why we're explaining all of this is, while it might sound insane today to say that magazines could have such a singular impact on shaping the mindset of teenagers and young people across an entire nation, in Japan, they really did. And the fashion magazine Kwakuma Ageha was such a trend-setting magazine for many young women in Japan at the time. This magazine, which was first published in 2005, largely dealt on the lifestyle, fashion, and makeup techniques of currently active hostesses, and was even referred to as by the Japanese sociologist Yadai Shinji as a hostess textbook or the hostess Bible. And Kwakuma Ageha was not just some niche publication. During the 2008-2009 period, the magazine reportedly sold between a staggering 350,000 to 400,000 copies, making it the first or second top-ranked teen magazine in the whole country. The magazine heavily contributed in reducing any type of remaining resistance in which some young women had towards the profession at the time. And because of such rise in the status of hostesses, many hostesses who are a frequent feature on the magazine even began making regular appearances in Japanese TV variety shows, amplifying their popularity even further. And for many young girls across Japan, this carefully curated image of the hostess on the magazines and TV shows could not seem more like a dream career. In the Japanese society, where women are conventionally pressured to be timid and not be outspoken, the hostesses on the TV variety programs confidently declared how much money they were earning from the job, while also displaying a level of visual beauty that many impressionable young individuals aspire to one day attain. And with the amalgamation of all of these factors, a rather interesting point in history arrived in Japan by around 2012, when most number of female high schoolers across the island nation desired to become, at least according to the surveys, not a doctor, not a lawyer, not a teacher, but a hostess once they have reached adulthood. But just as it seemed that the hostess club industry had reached the peak of its cultural influence in Japan at around the year 2012, the industry gradually began to take a turn for the worse from then onwards. By around 2014, smartphones and various forms of social media were now quite widespread across Japan, especially among the younger generation. Kwakuma Ageha, the Hostess Bible magazine that sold up to 450,000 annual copies between 2008 to 2009, rapidly lost its popularity, with their sales number in 2014 decreasing to a meager 50,000 copies. And in April 15th, 2014, the magazine was officially suspended from publication, only to continue this rather sad-looking cycle of republication and discontinuation several times throughout the late 2010s. But changes in media consumption were only a part of the story. While laws and regulations in Japan had once worked in favor of the hostess club industry in the past, it was now the very opposite of the case. To elaborate, the My Number system was implemented for the first time in Japan in 2016, which is essentially an identity document given to citizens of Japan and foreign residents that assigns a unique 12-digit individual number. And with the stricter registration laws now in place, it was now far more difficult for many female university students, as well as young daytime office workers in Japan, to secretly work at hostess clubs as a side job at night. But with that said, why was this such a devastating blow to the industry? This is as much of the allure of the hostess in Japan throughout the decades was very much based on the fact that many of them were not simply full-time bar working professionals. A lot of businessmen frequented hostess clubs with the idea that they were going to be drinking and conversing with educated women who were either studying or had a normal office job during the day, which was also the image that countless mangas and TV dramas had long depicted of the hostesses as well. So from 2016, young women in Japan who intended to become a hostess now had to make an official choice. Either become a full-time registered hostess or give up that idea and continue pursuing their university education, daytime office work, etc. Many young women chose the latter. Now, this of course did not completely stop many young women in Japan from aspiring to one day become a hostess. Some could frankly care less about going to university or having a normal day job, and had no problem becoming an openly registered full-time hostess and have it be stamped on their My Number records. But this also honestly meant that the hostess club industry post-2016 attracted a somewhat different demographic of young women into the occupation compared to its historical past. Female individuals who did not really place much heavy emphasis on higher education and had no problem being associated as a full-time night industry worker. And before long, certain stereotypes about hostesses began spreading online among Japan's salarymen, who have always traditionally been the main customer base of the hostess clubs. Some began asking questions such as, to quote this anonymous netizen, "Why do I have to pay money to?" Let's paraphrase it politely, "An intellectually limited woman who is not even my girlfriend, and make her eat and drink with my own money." Others just described the experience even more bluntly, to quote, "For an awkward normie like myself, it is literally a place where I pay money to go and get humiliated." To explain on this, in the past, hostesses with educated backgrounds and a knack for reading the air, as how it's often described in Japan, would skillfully flatter, praise, and emotionally uplift the male clients who visited the club. But now, the widespread social impression of a hostess club for many in Japan is one where you walk in only to be greeted by a rather shallow-minded full-time bar worker and have a conversation with them that roughly goes along like this. "Masa-san, how much money do you make per month?" I made around 250,000 yen last month." "Eh? I just had a client come in yesterday who made that much money in less than a day. You have to work harder, Masa-san. Ganbatte ne." Needless to say, it really does not take much research on the Japanese side of the internet to see that many salarymen today in Japan, especially the younger generation, absolutely detest the idea of going to hostess clubs and actively try to avoid visiting them if their old superior at the workplace attempt to drag them there after work, or so on. And with this conspicuously reduced demand from what has historically been their largest customer base, it is perhaps only natural that many hostess clubs across Japan have ultimately come to the point of filing for bankruptcies. So as the situation was already gradually getting worse for the hostess clubs from around 2014, the global pandemic which broke out in 2020 gave the industry another massive blow. As many of our audience who were living in Japan during the time may remember, the Japanese government declared a state of emergency in 2020, which placed strict limitations on the operating hours of nightlife establishments across the country during the time. Hence, an ordinary hostess club's opening hours were limited to until 8 p.m., which was basically the equivalent of a death sentence for the establishments. unless the salaryman happened to be some kind of a hostess club addict. When he got off work at, let's say 6 p.m., which is still considered extremely early in Japan's corporate culture, he would still need to grab dinner first, and will barely have any time to then head to the hostess clubs before the closing hours. And even if he did make time to head to the hostess club by literally running towards the establishment from his office building after finishing work, he had to then get his temperature checked, hands sanitized, mask put on, and talk with the hostess at a distance through a transparent plastic barrier. This meant that the calm, intimate conversations that once defined the Japanese hostess club experience were suddenly replaced by something closer to a comedy sketch. Customers shouting, "Can you hear me?" to the hostess sitting across the acrylic divider. Needless to say, much of the remaining customer base of the hostess clubs thought that all of this was just way too much of a hassle and objectively no longer worth the money that they had to spend. So what happened? Many just stopped going to hostess clubs. We're sorry that we can't think of a more eloquent phrasing than this, but that's just what happened. Many just stopped going to hostess clubs, beginning from this particular era. But while some then could come to think that the pandemic was the final nail in the coffin for much of Japan's hostess clubs, that was actually, surprisingly, not the case. With hostess clubs at the time still being somewhat considered in Japan as a fairly important part of the corporate entertainment culture, largely thanks to its remaining image from the past, the Japanese government decided to actively subsidize and financially support these establishments during the period, allowing many of them to survive through and subsequently avoid bankruptcy. So then the ultimate question has to be asked: why are more hostess clubs going bankrupt today, even when compared to days during the peak of the global health crisis? A few things can be said. There's first a clear economic aspect. Japan is, objectively speaking, no longer this ultra-wealthy nation that once towered over the rest of Asia in terms of GDP per capita. The yen is tremendously weak. Ordinary citizens suffer daily with rising inflation, combined with stagnant or even decreasing wages, and many Japanese companies are thus aggressively cutting back on expenses such as company dinners or client entertainment. This means that a lot of the business talks that once took place at the tables of the hostess clubs in the past are increasingly being replaced by online meetings in the post-pandemic era. And to be brutally honest, not all clientele of hostess clubs have historically gone there only as an extension of business. Many just frankly went in order to converse and interact with someone of the opposite gender. But now, if this is indeed the customer's primary objective, hostess clubs in the post-2020 era have become one of the most cost-ineffective places to head to in order to accomplish this. Sure, back in the days of the analog Japan, men simply didn't have many options. But now, if conversing with a person of the opposite gender in a drinking setting is their goal, then there are now incomparably more options in Japan relative to the past, such as the much cheaper girls' bars, which have become increasingly popular among the budget-constrained Japanese men in recent years. And if meeting women was their only objective, then unlike in the past, there are now more dating apps, matchmaking apps, and even papakatsu apps in Japan than one could ever count, naturally leading to a significantly reduced demand for hostess clubs in this regard as well. But with that said, this is still the surface level, politically correct answer. The most fundamental, visceral reason behind the rapid decline of hostess clubs, especially in the post-pandemic era, lies in something far more damaging to the industry's reputation. In recent years, hostesses have increasingly become publicly associated with criminal behavior and financial fraud. This is it. This was their final nail in the coffin. Over the past few years, Helen and I honestly cannot count how many times we have turned on the news and once again see some kind of a fraud or even a murder case associated with a hostess. There are just so many, but by far the two most memorable ones that we can think of is the infamous 2.5 billion yen financial scandal of Himeka, who's often referred to in Japan as Reiwa's #1 hostess, and the murder of the hostess Toshino Hirasawa by her customer Manabu Wakui in front of her Tower Mansion residence in Nishi Shinjuku. Both cases are worthy of having their own dedicated video, but for now, let us just briefly go over the key details. Himeka Nakamoto was an immensely popular hostess across the entirety of Japan thanks to her frequent appearances on mass media platforms, not to mention her enormous social media presence. I mean, her popularity and influence among the young Japanese women at the peak of her success really cannot be overstated. As in, you could consider her in the hostess club industry as what the host Roland was to the nation's host club industry. And she told her fans that through hard work and courage, they could also be as successful as her. At one point, it really did seem like she was going to single-handedly revive the type of positive image of the hostess as the strong, independent, socially intelligent professional, much like how they were perceived in Japan in the 90s to the 2000s. But then, it turned out that much of her image was allegedly a lie. It was accused that she did not earn all of her wealth through sheer hard work. Instead, it allegedly came through emotional manipulation. In 2024, her ex-fiancé publicly exposed that Himeka received gifts and often straight-up cash transfers into her bank account from him, totaling over 2.5 billion yen, which is roughly around $16 million, under the promise that she would retire from the hostess industry and marry him. And again, they were literally engaged. However, after receiving millions of dollars from her ex-fiancé under the condition of marriage, she later went on to allegedly break off the relationship and block him on all of her social media platforms. There were also the allegations of severe tax evasion on her part as well. Now, when her ex-fiancé took her to court over these accusations, he actually lost the lawsuit, with his case ultimately being dismissed. And you could argue that Himeka was finally vindicated, and although she did not, should take him to court for defamation. But unfortunately, especially in East Asian countries such as Japan and South Korea, we're not sure about China, as we've never lived in China nor speak Mandarin, allowing us to watch their news. But through living our lives, mostly in Japan and South Korea, we've seen firsthand that at least in these two countries, the allegations often do 99% of the work when it comes to shaping the public perception on a certain case or matter. Many TV and newspaper reporters in Japan could not actually care less about the real truth behind the case and are only concerned with generating views and traction. For those in our audience who have lived in Japan for a while, you will likely know exactly what we are talking about. Reporters are constantly covering sensational arrests or scandals involving alleged suspects, often before the individuals involved have even stepped foot in a courtroom. But have you ever seen an article or a news report in Japan that later covers the final court verdict, especially when the verdict vindicates the accused? Never. I've actually never seen one such report throughout my decade-plus years of living in Japan. Hence, most in Japan still recognize Himeka for her alleged financial scandal involving her ex-fiancé, while having no idea that her ex-fiancé's allegations were later dismissed in court. And one could even argue that this severe destruction of Himeka's carefully crafted public image, that of a hard-working young woman rising through the hostess club industry from a humble working-class background, effectively eradicated whatever remaining positive perception of the hostess that still existed in Japan. An image that had been so painstakingly and methodically cultivated through Japan's popular media over the past few decades, it was now all mostly shattered. The case of the hostess, Toshino Hirasawa, unfolds along somewhat similar lines to that of Himeka, except that Hirasawa had to face a far more tragic fate. Manabu Wakui was a regular customer at the hostess club that Hirasawa herself owned in Tokyo's Eno district. He went on to fall in love with her and propose marriage, and Hirasawa allegedly told him that if he wanted to marry her, he would have to first prove his commitment to her by remitting money into her bank account. Wakui, believing in her words, sold his car, sold his bike, received extensive loans from the bank, and went on to allegedly give tens of millions of yen over to Hirasawa. Then afterwards, Hirasawa blocked him completely on all social media and messenger apps and cut off all contacts with him. Wakui, now buried in millions of yen in bank debt, eventually went on to unalive Hirasawa right outside of her upscale tower mansion apartment building located in Nishi Shinjuku, an affluent neighborhood in Tokyo's Shinjuku ward, widely known for its expensive high-rise apartments and office buildings. And we could go on and on with similar recent cases of financial crimes and scandals revolving around hostesses against their customer base, but we believe you guys see the pattern. So from the timeline of events, beginning roughly in the early to mid-2010s, from Japanese society moving away from its almost Galapagos-like, isolated handling of information, when most people received popular content only strictly through television and magazines, and entering into the age of smartphones and social media, the introduction of the My Number system in 2016, leading to a different demographic of young women entering into the hostess club industry from then onwards compared to its traditional past, or at least stopping the inflow of a certain demographic of women into the industry, the pandemic, and most devastatingly for the industry, the subsequent attachment of serious criminality onto the public image of hostesses in the post-pandemic era. What was once considered as one of the most desired career destinations for female high schoolers in Japan in the year 2012 has now effectively turned itself into an occupation where, if you were to ask the average young woman on the street today of whether she would like to become a hostess, she would likely respond, almost with this sense of thinly veiled disdain.
キャバクラで働きませんかって言われたら
But with that said, can Japan's hostess clubs ever make a comeback? We honestly do not think so. What Helen and I observed throughout our research was that the people working in the hostess club industry, the hostess club owners, the hostesses, the staffs and relevant personnel are all aware of the fact that their industry is in decline and are in fact consciously making various attempts at regaining their popularity, not to mention recover their public image. But for some reason, whenever they try to do something to improve the situation, it ironically just ends up making things worse, almost every single time. Let us provide you with a few examples before we conclude. Much of Japan's hostess industry personnel have come to believe in the recent years that in today's age of social media, hostesses have to be more active on SNS platforms such as Instagram in order to attract customers. Hence, many hostesses were encouraged to move away from the image of the private hostess of the traditional past and create social media accounts, in which many did. However, although this move may have initially helped them to some extent, it ultimately led to a further deterioration of their national public image and even assisted in driving away what had long been their most loyal and biggest client base, middle-aged to older men. To briefly explain, many hostesses in the past few years sought to attract customers by posting their lifestyles and daily activities on various social media platforms, with that mainly being Instagram and TikTok. However, it frequently became a major topic of discussion on Japanese online forums whenever a hostess was caught talking negatively about their customers on social media. And the pattern was, as seen in the story of Himeka and Hirasawa, almost always the same. It typically involved much older male customers who genuinely believed that they were in a real relationship with the hostess, even to the point of believing that they were going to get married to the hostess soon, and a hostess who received large sums of money from these customers based on this premise, then later go on to rebuke them behind their backs on social media. And the criticism by the hostesses towards their customers usually almost always went along the lines of how these old men were so creepy and socially underdeveloped for believing what the hostesses said inside the clubs were actually real. How they could not believe that these customers failed to realize that all of the talk about love and marriage was simply just a part of doing business for the hostesses. Let's have a look at this Instagram story posted by a Japanese hostess, which circulated around the Japanese side of the internet last year. A customer sent a message to the hostess. To quote the message, "What are you doing? I thought you said that you're at home? If you're that busy, then so be it. I don't even know what you're doing out there during all this time, and I don't know why I have to stay in a romantic relationship with you while having to suit myself to all these aspects of you." And the hostess screenshot this particular message from the customer and posted it on her Instagram story while writing, to quote, "I am only tolerating you because I think that I can get more money out of you in the future. Do you really think that I like you? You sick person. I am 19 years old and I feel disgusted. You're a gross 40-year-old man who's the same age as my parents. You mentally ill person." End quote. Again, this is a recurring pattern. When the 25-year-old hostess Hirasawa was unalived by her customer in 2024, much of the Japanese public actually sided with the customer, as Hirasawa had done something almost identical to what the 19-year-old hostess from the previously mentioned Instagram story exactly did. Consistently make fun of Wakui, the customer, on social media, in that he was such an annoying old person who had no sense of reality, and that it was entirely his fault that he handed all of his money to her.
なんかストーカーのお客さんって結構たくさんいるんだいたしいるんだけど、その人だけは匂いが違うんだよね。殺してやるってカッコつけで言ってる殺してやるじゃなくて、なんだろう、本当にその感じなの。もうストーカー気質で、ネチネチした感じ、陰湿な感じ、話し方とかも 土下座してアスカさんの奴隷になるのでお金貸してくださいみたいな言われて、でそんで
So while hostesses were initially actively pushed by the higher ups in the industry to open up SNS accounts, share their lifestyle and thoughts in order to adjust to the times and increase their relatability, rather than maintain the mystique of the hostess as in the past, all of it just backfired big time, as it literally drove away by far their single biggest spending customer base, the middle-aged to older men. Because if we think back for a moment, what was the overarching image of the man who frequented hostess clubs throughout the majority of Japan's post-war history? Successful businessman in a suit, talking business with clients, while a beautiful and well-educated hostess sat beside him, pouring drinks. But if you were to ask the average Japanese person on the street today, in 2026, on the stereotypical image of the man who frequents hostess clubs, the answer would likely be a lonely, socially awkward middle-aged or older man, handing over large sums of money to young hostesses, in the hopes that he might somehow end up in a romantic relationship with them. And this stereotype was firmly solidified in the era post-2023, much thanks to the countless stories that emerged during this time of hostesses describing the behavior of some of their middle-aged or older customers on social media, then going on to mock them in a rather merciless fashion. And needless to say, in Japan, where maintaining face and social reputation is considered immensely important, many middle-aged and older men do not want to be labeled as a lonely, socially awkward person, in which would largely be the case now if they were somehow spotted one day by someone they know as they entered into a hostess club. So while this new stereotype did not stop all middle-aged and older men in Japan from heading to the hostess clubs, it did indeed become a realistic deterring factor for many. Let us provide you with one last example of hostesses making things worse for themselves, ironically in their endeavor towards the relative recovery of the industry. After Himeka's financial scandal, as well as the death of the hostess Hirasawa, both of which occurred in 2024, many hostesses knew that their public image was rapidly deteriorating as people who extracted exorbitant amounts of money from their customers in the false promise of marriage. So in response, several hostesses began appearing on news platforms such as Abema to give interviews and explain their side of the story. Let's have a look at this one video, for example, that currently has almost 700,000 views. Although this particular hostess was specifically asked for her thoughts on the crime case involving Hirasawa and her customer, Wakui, she literally begins off her interview with this first sentence.
婚姻時代の月給がもう時給ぐらいのガッと、はい。
And this is essentially the core of her argument, constantly speaking in a rather condescending tone against the normal, everyday hardworking people in Japan with ordinary day jobs, that she earns the equivalent of their monthly salary in an hour, how she lives in this sparkling world, and that the normal citizens are thus just jealous and are committing crimes against the hostesses in this inevitable sense of inferiority.
こんなキラキラした世界で自立して稼げて羨ましいと思われるかもしれないですけど、やっぱりそういった危険も隣り合わせ。
Needless to say, the comment section of this video just absolutely erupted with anger with almost 4,000 comments, and out of these comments, we literally could not find one single comment that spoke positively of the interviewing hostesses. Not a single one. So once again, another example of how it could have actually been much better for them to just stay put, rather than persistently try to do something in order to reverse their downfall. Because through numerous interviews such as these, all that the hostesses are essentially doing is just solidifying what was once internet gossip circulating online as confirmed facts. To quote the Japanese netizen we mentioned earlier in this video, hostess clubs are literally a place where I pay my own money to go and get humiliated. So in that sense, it almost feels as though many active hostesses across Japan today possess an ability that could almost be described as this anti-Midas touch. As in, rather than having things in which they touch turn into gold, have it turn into, well, let's just say an element much less desirable than gold. And honestly, it seems increasingly likely that things will carry on this way, no matter what attempts are made, whether by the owners of the hostess clubs or the hostesses themselves. The gradual decline of Japan's hostess club industry appears to be more and more inevitable due to a flood of different factors. The changing times in Japan, the firm attachment of criminality, or at least acute ethical questionability, onto the hostesses, and the way that many of them generate their sales numbers, and so much more. Now, let's not get this wrong. hostess clubs across Japan will not suddenly all simultaneously go bankrupt, especially the ones located in the wealthiest nightlife districts of Japan, such as Roppongi and Akasaka. In fact, some of these establishments at Roppongi and so on that are considered as the creme de la creme hostess clubs in the entire nation may even thrive, particularly as wealth inequality in Japan continues to increase. But with that said, this eventual phasing out of the vast majority of conventional hostess clubs located all across Japan that have once dominated so much of the nation's night entertainment scene over the past several decades will likely continue. The downfall will be gradual, but nonetheless inexorable.